I looked at his human rights abuses, which
Yeah.
are the human rights organizations have documented. So I think that's pretty firm there. But I know for the show itself, Mafia Spies, the showrunners, really, really important. They can change our society. They would threaten our democracy if they're not properly overseen by people of good character. And having the moral courage, physical courage, that is a great thing. And we certainly give out awards and medals for people for physical courage. But sometimes in life, the most difficult thing is moral courage. And to make sure that when things are going awry, when people are being led astray, when things are being abused, that people are willing and have the moral courage to speak up and say the right thing and do the right thing. And I think that's also something that is a lesson out of Mafia Spies.
Yeah. And, I keep forgetting to ask you, by the way, with this time period when Roselli and Giancana were recruited to do this, how did it wind down? Did we find that out? Like, was there a day where Mayhew or someone went to them and said, guess what, it's off?
Well, it really wound down with the death of JFK. After JFK is killed, essentially the activity of Bobby Kennedy ends as the Attorney General. People who work with him say essentially he didn't speak about the mafia again. And JFK is killed in November '63. A year later, Bobby has left as Attorney General and run for the Senate. He becomes a senator from the state of New York, a U.S. senator from the state of New York. And Johnson decided, you know what? Just let it go with Castro. In essence, Castro won by just evading assassination, by all these different maneuvers, and by, to some extent, a large extent, by our own fault, by our own mistakes. And so when Kennedy is killed, Johnson, in turn, he turns his attention to another communist foe, the Vietnamese, and we enter the Vietnam War. And so Cuba goes in the, really in the back seat of foreign policy.
That's so bizarre. It's 90 miles off the coast. And they've been trying to kill this guy with the most insane methods over, I guess, the last 3 years or something like that that point. And
well,
now they're just like, eh.
Mafia Spies, we had a premiere in Miami, and I know we got some criticism for what I think is a fairly even-handed historical presentation of Castro. Was Castro a good guy or a bad guy? And I think he's a bad guy. Don't get me wrong about that. I think he was a man who was a murderer, who had his own firing squads, who there was very quick justice, quote unquote justice against his political enemies. If you go to Cuba, as we did for this book, I went to Cuba with my wife Joyce, and when you go to Havana, it looks like it's stuck in time.
Yeah.
It's a society caught in the 1950s. 60 years later, it seems like it's a society in amber, if you will. So whatever good Castro may have meant for some people in Cuba, overall, he was a very dark figure in our history, and certainly in Miami, that feeling of anti-Castro and it runs very high among the Cuban exiles, and it has influenced our policy. I do think that if we had more exchanges with Cuba, I think our influence would permeate throughout Cuban society. Maybe I'm idealistic or naive, even to that point, but I do think we would have an impact on Cuba, and I think by just totally isolating them, it's not necessarily the most effective way to have a regime change there.
It drives them more back into their own corner.
Yeah, I think freedom is something that's contagious, and I think democracy and freedom is something that people will emulate if they see the fruits of that. And so hopefully someday we see a democracy in Cuba.
That'd be pretty cool.
I would think so.
What was it like? I mean, obviously, you talk about it being like it's stuck in time, but like, did you get to talk with people while you were down there? Were you also as a journalist and someone who writes on topics like this? Is there any nervousness going there because they might be watching you?
No, I have to say, when we went, I basically had finished up the book, and I just wanted to eyeball some of the places that I was writing about. So fundamentally, that was that. I did rely on some documents that had been, and books that had been written by people that were essentially either actually Cuban historians or were pro-Castro, or some certainly more open to Castro's ways than frankly I was. I looked at his human rights abuses, which are the human rights organizations have documented. So I think that's pretty firm there. But I know for the show itself, Mafia Spies, the showrunners, Tom Donahue and Ilan Arboleda, they went to Cuba as well, and they did interview people. You'll see that in Mafia Spies. There are a number of different Cuban historians, and so the first chapter we felt it was really important for getting some of the Cuban history and how did Castro come to power and the reasons why, and also to understand why the CIA was acting and the United States government acted the way it did. I think for a lot of younger people that's really a necessary history lesson. So yes, it's a story about two gangsters hired by the CIA to kill Castro, and that's the fundamental focus. But in doing so, we tell a lot of the history of this time period.
Nothing like a couple gangsters to get people excited about some good history. It's a good way to. It's a good tipping point.
Absolutely, I think it's the great murder conspiracy, spy conspiracy story of our time. The fact also, I had an editor who used to say that, this is like a Reese's peanut butter cup. And I said, what do you mean by that? He said, two great flavors, chocolate and peanut butter together. Well, Mafia Spies is like that. It's two great, extraordinary stories. It's spying and it's the mafia together in one great adventure. So that's what it really made Mafia Spies, to me, very appealing as a storyteller.
Yeah, and I also think that when you get into the middle of how quickly something like this happened, how quickly it spun up, like we talked about earlier, with suddenly like, oh, espionage, nope, killing now, and you bring in criminal organizations, it's like, it makes sense once you look at it, but you still can't believe that they just met at a hotel and had dinner, broke bread, and said, yeah, you're in? All right, great, let's go.
Well, when I talk about moral courage, on one level, I'm kind of dismissing the CIA and Eisenhower and other, the Kennedys, who said, well, Castro, he looks like another Hitler, or we could develop into another Hitler, and he's willing to allow nuclear missiles and have it pointed at our head 90 miles away. We have to do something about that. But not enough people spoke up, and later on, when all of this came out, there was a guy named Richard Bissell who was he was the number 2 character, and he's a pretty prominent character in Mafia Spies, my book. But he's in the show as well, and there's a clip that we show of Bissell saying later on, well, it wasn't a bad idea to kill Castro, but it was a bad idea to get involved with the Mafia, and because you can't control the Mafia. It's they control you. And so I think that's when I talk about moral courage and having people of good character, I think that's why it's really important. And people with experience as well, for people to be involved in setting our foreign policy and the affairs of state, because the world looks to the United States for leadership. And so we have to have people of good character and people with experience and people with the moral courage to do the right thing.
Thank you for watching the video, guys. If you haven't already subscribed, please smash that subscribe button and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.